And I'm excited to be able to share some of the results from the round 1 survey with you today and to tell you about the next steps that we'll be taking as well. So an introduction to CREST.BD. I'll go through this fairly quickly, being as many of you are familiar with the network, but for those of you who are on the line who are new to our group, this is our strategic vision for research and knowledge exchange and some of the things that are important to us. First of all, we believe that effective psychosocial research and knowledge exchange in bipolar disorders is critical. We built this network because we thought there was a gap in the science in research focusing in particular on the psychological and social factors that relate to bipolar disorder. Our job is to try and fill that gap. The second part of our strategic vision is that essentially what we do, we advance bipolar disorder psychosocial research and the application of this research in Canada and internationally. And in doing so, what we hope to do is optimize the health and the quality of life of people with bipolar disorder and diminish the stigma that people face in conjunction with it. This is the network and some of the suspects involved. And these are the types of research methods that we use. I just want to pull a couple of things out as important to you today. First of all, this idea that we are focusing on something called integrated knowledge exchange. Essentially, what this means is that we recognize there are lots of different kinds of expertise. We think that lived experience expertise held by people who live on a daily basis with bipolar disorder and their family members and supports is critical to involve in research. So there is very little that we do in terms of research or knowledge exchange that doesn't involve people with bipolar disorder in every step of the process. So for example, that means that we hold grants in conjunction with people with BD, we publish with people with bipolar disorder, and critically we involve them in disseminating the research findings that we identify. The other thing that I'll pull out for you is that we work within the framework of what's known as community-based participatory research. And that's a research framework where we work hand in hand with people with bipolar disorders as essentially as co-researchers or peer researchers. This is our organizational structure. So you can see that we have a number of peer researchers involved with a network. I believe Mike Scott is on the line today. Sarah Lapsley was supposed to be doing this webinar with me today. However, winter has left a lot of people with flu in its wake this year, and she's got proper old flu and is in bed with the shivers today. So she'll be with us in spirit, but not actually physically during the webinar. We have a community advisory group that is made up of people with bipolar disorder and their clinicians, and we have a national advisory group as well. In addition to that, we have several hundred people across Canada who are involved in what we call the community consultation group, and they help guide our research and knowledge translation. We also have a number of partner organizations. Sally's already mentioned the importance of the Mood Disorders Association of Ontario for us, in particular in conjunction with this Delphi study. So we're really happy to have you guys in Toronto on board today, and even if you do have snacks, and we're so much jealous of that, we are happy to have you joining us. So to this idea of self-management in bipolar disorder. Back when I first started doing bipolar research, this was the first study that had looked at what people do to stay well with bipolar disorder, the wellness strategies that they use. It was conducted in Australia by a woman called Sarah Russell, and it still makes for a good read. If you haven't read this publication that came out from this study or this small book that was produced, it still makes for a good read about some of the things that people with bipolar disorder do to stay well with the condition. These things include things like accepting their diagnosis, mindfulness, looking for early warning signs, learning to manage sleep and stress, making lifestyle changes, treatment, and stay well plans. We wanted to start to build on the literature in self-management and bipolar disorder. So back in about 2007, we started this study to look at self-management strategies or wellness strategies in people who were living really well with a condition. So this was a qualitative study. That means we did interviews or focus groups with a number of people with bipolar disorder. Qualitative studies tend to be smaller in sample size, but this is a reasonable size for a study of this nature, 32 people. And all of these people with bipolar disorder were living successfully with their condition. We interviewed them and put them in focus groups and asked them about what they were doing to stay well with bipolar disorder, and this is what we heard in that study. We heard that sleep, rest, diet, and exercise are important. Monitoring and adjusting over time. This idea of meditation and reflective practices. psychoeducation or building your understanding about bipolar disorder and educating other people about your condition, social support or connecting with others, and having a plan in place for when things go wrong. If we put the two study results side by side, this is the Australian study that I mentioned and our later Vancouver study, you'll start to see that there are some themes that are resonating between the two. So the idea of mindfulness came up across the two studies, the idea of managing sleep and stress, of making lifestyle changes, of having a plan for when things go wrong. So we were starting to see internationally literature and science being built on self-management in bipolar disorder. This literature was summarized in a very nice review paper produced by our collaborators at Lancaster University, the Spectrum Centre in the UK, and I encourage you to have a look at this paper if you really want to get a taste for where the literature on self-management of bipolar disorder is. However, there are some gaps in the literature on self-management. First of all, there are methodological limitations of all of the existing studies to date of some form or another. For example, our own research was qualitative. Qualitative research is very useful for building knowledge in an area where there isn't much, but it's not very generalizable. The Australian study had some methodological limitations too of a different nature. There's also the question of where we're pulling our evidence from, and if we're tapping into all of the potential evidence that's out there, all of the potential knowledge that's out there about what works for living well with bipolar disorder. And then critically, when you looked at the literature, there's a very large gap in terms of self-management strategies that work for either episodes of hypomania or episodes of mania. We know barely anything currently on what people can do to stop progression into these elevated mood states in terms of self-management. When I say we know barely anything, actually we think that we know quite a lot. There's a lot of knowledge out there, but very little of it has trickled through to scientific data or research studies to date. So we designed our Delphi study to fill this gap within the context of a community-engaged research model. The overall objective of the study was, first of all, to generate knowledge on what self-management strategies work best for A, keeping balance in mood in people with bipolar disorder, and B, stopping progression into elevated mood states, that is, into mood states of hypomania and episodes of mania. This is our definition that we came up with in CREST.BD with the particular help of Mike Scott. We looked at existing definitions of what a self-management strategy is, and then we made it very CREST-like. And this is how we understand self-management in BD. First of all, self-management refers to plans and or routines that a person with bipolar disorder can use to promote their health and quality of life. We think that healthcare providers can provide information to support self-management. We also think that family friends are critical in supporting self-management of the person with bipolar disorder, but typically, unless somebody is committed in hospital, it's the person with bipolar disorder who chooses and acts and applies their approach to self-management. Self-management strategies, as we've mentioned, can encompass a wide range of plans and activities. So I think this point is worth mentioning here in that when we think about self-management strategies, our understanding, and the understanding of our peer researchers when we came up with this definition, is that most of our activities, if we live with bipolar disorder, are choices and self-determined. So even if you look at something like taking medications for your condition, that really can be understood as a self-management strategy, in that you can choose to adhere or not to adhere. So now that we put the flesh a little bit on what our understanding of self-management was, I'll walk you through some of the study phases over the next 5 minutes or so. So the first thing that we did was we went back to all of the data that we had collected in our initial qualitative study that I told you about. We went back to all those interviews and focus groups, and we pulled out all of the strategies that people mentioned about how they were living well with bipolar disorder. We then performed a traditional scientific peer-reviewed literature search. The really meaty phase of the project, however, was what we termed the grey literature search. So this involved going to the non-usual suspects in terms of pulling information about self-management in bipolar disorder. So for example, we found all of the top books published on living well with bipolar disorder. We found the top international bipolar bloggers, the top bipolar websites, and the top YouTube videos that talked about ways for living well with bipolar disorder. So to give you a little bit more of an example of that, these are some of the top blogs that we went through. This was a really massive piece of work. This involved our peer researchers, people who live with bipolar disorder, who work hand in hand with us as researchers, going through the top 10 bipolar bloggers internationally, and literally trawling through each of their blogs to find their comments and the knowledge that had been gathered on self-management strategies for bipolar disorder. Here are some of the books that we went through. This was Mike Scott's endeavor, working through each of these page by page. We had over 4,000 candidate self-management strategies as a result of those searches of academic literature and grey literature. What we then did was started to distill them down. So obviously many of those were repeats, and we went through a process for many months by meeting as a team on a weekly basis and going through them all, taking out the ones that were repeats and looking for unique self-management strategies. After several months of hard work, we came up with about 493 strategies. The next phase of the study was to form 2 panels of experts to rate these strategies. So the first panel was one consisting of people with bipolar disorder who self-identified as living well. The second panel of experts we were looking for were healthcare providers who supported people with bipolar disorder. We built an online survey and asked them to rate each of those 400 and something strategies. So in this next slide, you can see a clearer example, this slide, of what one of those survey questions looked like. So this one, for example, the strategy is aim for 8 hours of sleep a night. And then the individual doing the survey would rate how helpful that strategy was, either for maintaining balance or for stopping progression into mania or hypomania. So essentially they were asked to rate each self-management strategy twice. You can imagine that this was a really lengthy survey to do. On average, it took people an hour to complete. I have to say, some people it took about 2 to 2.5 hours to complete, and that's including the healthcare providers. Many people were very diligent in going through it, very thoughtful in their responses, and this was a really big ask for us as researchers. We'd got to the point with the research where we thought that every one of those self-management strategies in there was potentially unique, and it wasn't our job at that point to start to whittle them down. But still, to ask people to do an hour to 2-hour online survey was a really big request. In order to help recruit the 2 panels that we need, we relied very heavily on our social media platforms. So we have a very active Facebook page, we have active Twitter accounts. We created a neat recruitment video, which you can still view online if you're interested in seeing it. We explored the use of things like 1 Minute Med School, which is a way of kind of animating bits of health information. And so we built a special 1 Minute Med School animated 1-minute video about the project and use that as a recruitment tool. And now we're at the phase of having completed round 1 of the survey. And so in the next part, the next sort of 5 to about 10 minutes of the presentation, I'm going to tell you about some of the research results that we've gleaned so far and the next steps in the process. So let's look at gender and age first of all. On the left-hand side of the slide here, you can see the sample of healthcare providers. On the right-hand side, you can see the people with bipolar disorder who completed the survey. In total, we had 51 healthcare providers and 101 people with bipolar disorder do the project. And you can see that this is pretty typical of an average internet survey or health research more broadly. About 2/3-ish of the samples, slightly over, were women, 1/3 or slightly less male, the same for the community member sample. We wouldn't really have expected any different, but I will, as an aside, mention to the guys who are online today that there is a real critical need and interest to really foster guys' engagement in healthcare and in healthcare research in particular. I believe that there are particular stigmas that apply to men with bipolar disorder and men who are facing mental health challenges more broadly. One way of addressing that and tackling stigma and changing the face of healthcare and research is to get involved in research more actively. So thank you to those of you who did, and please encourage your mates to do so as well. Looking at diagnosis of the people with bipolar disorder sample, you can see that there's about an equal split between people who self-described as having bipolar type 2 versus type 1. And in terms of the healthcare providers and the disciplines that they were affiliated with, we had about 50% of the sample who were psychiatrists, about another 13 or so of the sample who were psychologists, and then the remainder were peer support workers, mental health workers, a good solid number of occupational therapists, and a few social workers and other allied health professions mixed in there. Now, looking at geography, one of the neat things about Delphi surveys is that it gives you the chance to start to pool and tap into more international samples. This wasn't something that worked that effectively for us. Although we have some reach internationally, what we saw that it was that the majority of our sample was coming in from North America. Not surprisingly, as we're a Canadian network, the majority of the sample, about 90 of the 150 or so, were from Canada, the remainder from the United States, with a much smaller number coming from other countries around the world. When we look at this a bit more deeply, what we could see is that the sample of healthcare providers were actually more diverse in terms of geography than the community members. Only 3% of the people with bipolar disorder sample actually came from areas outside of North America, whereas 1/5 of the healthcare providers came from other areas other than North America. So that's interesting in itself, and we'll be publishing on this kind of process level data as we move forward. So looking at some of the results that we found. First of all, perhaps one of the biggest take-home messages from this process is that there was a very high level of consensus between the two panels on the ratings of the self-management strategies. So the people with bipolar disorder and the healthcare providers showed a very high correlation between the self-management strategies and how they ranked them and rated them. Overall, strategies about early warning signs, not surprisingly, were very prominent for ratings around stopping progression into hypomania and mania. So no real surprises there. Interestingly, from my perspective, strategies about relationships and emotional regulation were prominent for the theme of maintaining balance. This was of particular interest to me. Overall, across the two panels, what we saw was that strategies for maintaining balance were actually rated higher, generally, than those for stopping progression. Let's get into a little bit more detail around some of these results. While there was pretty high consensus across the two panels, there were some interesting, although slight, differences between the two as well. For example, at least kind of, qualitatively, healthcare providers had more strategies for stopping progression in their top quartile, that's the top quarter, the top 25% of responses, than the community members or people with bipolar disorder did. People with bipolar disorder rated strategies about social support lower than healthcare providers for both maintaining balance and stopping progression. I thought this was a particularly interesting and surprising result. What about the low-rated strategies, the ones that weren't endorsed very highly? The very lowest rated of all was take St. John's wort. Interestingly, strategies that talked about spirituality received low ratings across the two panels. Now, this isn't to say that spirituality isn't important or very important for some people with bipolar disorder. We know from our research into quality of life and our previous self-management research that about 1/4 to 1/3 of people with bipolar disorder will say that spirituality is critical for them for living well. I think what you're seeing with this particular Delphi project is that probably spirituality is just maybe very important for 1/4 of the sample and maybe not important at all for another 3/4. And so overall what you see is that this self-management strategy is endorsed more lower than other self-management strategies. This one's interesting though, Strategies about regulating diet generally didn't rate highly in either of the two panels. And then this finding on parenting and sex, well, no strategies on parenting came out in the top quarter, and just one self-management strategies that related to sexual function came through. This issue about parenting not coming out in the top of the pack is probably also an issue of frequency of endorsement, in that many of the sample wouldn't have been parents and wouldn't have been able to speak to this. So how do we move forward to the next round of the survey? Delphi Methods asks the panels to do the initial survey, then you whittle the number down again, and then you ask them to do another version of the survey. We've decided that we will choose an equal number of strategies that have been described in round one as working well for maintaining balance and well for stopping progression into mania or hypomania. And this is how that looks. What we decided to do after a couple of weeks of thinking about this fairly carefully was take the top quartile. That means the highest 25% of strategies for either maintaining balance or stopping progression. So that's this section up here. And that gives us an equal number of both types of strategies to put into the second survey. What this means in terms of numbers is that you'll remember that there were 436 strategies in round one. This is now down to a total of 154 strategies. Participants in round two will be asked to rate 70 of those for both maintaining balance and stopping progression at the same time. And then 42 strategies they'll be asked to rate either just for maintaining balance or just in relation to stopping progression. We think, and we've timed it, we think that this round two of the survey is going to take about 15, maximum 20 minutes to complete. I can hear some of you breathing a sigh of relief at that. Not literally, but I can imagine you breathing a sigh of relief. Because you know what my next question is going to be. I know that a lot of people on the line today are participants from round one of Delphi. I'm asking you at this point to give us some more of your time, again 15 or 20 minutes, and to complete the second phase of the study, which has just gone live today. So you will have been sent an email from Nusha, the research coordinator who's organizing this project, inviting you to come back into the shorter version of the survey and to go through that select number of self-management strategies again. That survey is going to be open for 2 weeks from today. So how, just so I just have a couple more slides left and then we'll open this up for questions, but how are we going to share our research findings as we go along with the wider community? One of the things we do quite heavily in the CREST.BD network is blog. We run a research blog, and blogs are really neat because they give us a way of sharing research results more expediently, not just waiting for a scientific paper to come out, for example. We've already blogged quite heavily on the Delphi projects, and we're going to continue to do that. So, for example, you can go to the research blog site on the website, the page on the website, and you can see a number of blogs on the Delphi project which we've produced, which have been written by myself or the other academic researchers or peer researchers like Sarah Lapsley and Mike Scott. Okay, so there'll be more blogs coming out. Of course, we'll be producing scientific papers. We expect probably about 2 or 3 papers to come out of this particular project. And really, that's really bringing me back round to the end of the presentation, and to revisit that slide again. You'll remember that I started this talk by talking about my hometown of Roberts Creek on the Sunshine Coast of British Columbia. This is taken down the beach from the pier, and we have a community event every year, which is actually, in the this is the entrance to the pier and the walk down to it, and it's called the Mandela. Every year, for about a week, an artist comes in and draws the outline of a community art project, and then essentially anybody can come and be given a section of the Mandela to complete. And having participated in this process, you you get involved in the painting of it, and you watch the process, and you think, God, how is this going to form anything that's cohesive? It looks like a mess. Everybody's doing their own thing, and you wonder, how the process is going to be. And then as the thing crystallizes, and what happens is that you realize that as a community, you've been able to vision and create something that you wouldn't have been able to create in isolation. Essentially, that the product is more than the sum of its parts. I think that Delphi studies and Delphi research methods allow us to do just this as well. I believe that our Delphi study and self-management strategies for bipolar disorder can give us a collective voice that's powerful and allow us to analyze the evidence and the knowledge that we have around the world on what works for bipolar disorder more effectively than we could do working within traditional kind of scientific paradigms. So I encourage you to get involved in the second stage of the survey. I want to make some thank yous before I close down at this point, in particular to the 152 people who did that incredibly long Delphi Round 1 survey. You guys rock. Thank you so much for your time and dedication. To our funders, in particular to Coast Capital Savings Foundation, who did fund this particular Delphi project. And at this stage, we are ready to move on to the question and answer stage of the webinar. If you're interested in hearing more about CREST.BD or are new to our work, what you have in front of you now is some different portals for communication and dialogue. What I'm seeing in the chat is that there are some issues. So question from Tim, thank you for that. Is it possible to join the survey if you didn't participate in the first round? Unfortunately not. Part of the issue is that the round 1 participants have to be the round 2 participants. However, that isn't to say that there won't be opportunities to get engaged with the final stages of figuring out the very final results for the Delphi process, and I would invite you to get involved in that stage. I have a feeling what will happen is that we will complete round 2 of the survey, and then we're going to have maybe, I don't know, let's say 40 or 50 strategies that look like they might be winners in the 2 categories. However, some of those are probably going to be still fairly similar. So for example, there might be a little cluster of strategies about mindfulness or a cluster around sleep. We'll use some statistical techniques to figure out the cream of the crop, but we'll also use community-engaged research methods there as well. So my plan is to come back to the community at that point and say, okay, well, these are the ones statistically that look solid for us, but we have these 6, say, around this particular theme of self-management. We need you to help pick the ones that are most feasible and useful in your daily lives. So to your question, Tim, that would be great if you could get involved in that stage of the research process. And there'll be other opportunities, of course, in terms of sharing the findings from this study more widely and getting them out into the hands of people that need them. A question from Julia about will there be a chance to join us today, and so you'll be able to access that through the one of CREST.BD's research projects that we have ongoing currently. We have a very big stream of research focusing on quality of life in bipolar disorder, including the building of a Skookum resource center, a web-based resource center for people with bipolar disorder. And yes, the answer in brief is that the Delphi methods, the Delphi results are going to be embedded in that online research center. Okay, interesting question about whether, I think the question is around people having access or not to the internet, the digital divide as it's been described here, and this biasing the results, the fact that we did this survey over the internet. Yes and no. About 85 to 90% of Canadians, for example, have access to the internet. Having said that, I wonder if some of our lack of geographical spread and reach around the world with this project is partly around web access issues. There are certainly other factors that will be taking some account of that, like language barriers. Our survey was only done in English. We weren't even funded sufficiently to be able to do it in French Canadian. So there are obvious language and barrier issues around these kinds of projects, and certainly some technological and web issues that we should be aware of moving forward. However, having said that, I think there are certain things about web-based research that actually bode quite well. So, for example, I spoke earlier about the hard time we have sometimes getting guys engaged in health research. The same can be said for youth. However, youth are more active on the internet, are more internet savvy than older adults, and so these kind of methods give us a way potentially of engaging with youth with bipolar disorder in a way that's very accessible and friendly and normal for them. So there are pros and cons. Great question, thank you. So interesting question here around the relationship in self-management between people with concurrent disorders. So this is a question for somebody who has experienced post-traumatic stress disorder and bipolar disorder at the same time, and the PTSD makes it difficult to make healthy choices around managing bipolar disorder. Have I found this brought up in research? Concurrent disorders are a huge issue in research, and certainly something that's very challenging in bipolar disorders research. This isn't something that we have tackled in this particular study head on. However, as a clinician who works with people with bipolar disorder, it's certainly something that I'm very familiar with. So a lot of what I see, for example, is concurrent substance misuse problems, gambling problems, or anxiety disorders, or physical health, concomitant physical health problems that go hand in hand with the bipolar disorder. And often it makes effective therapy and effective self-management that much more difficult, because you have to think about what to tackle first, which areas of self-management are impacted by the other condition in question, and it becomes a more complicated dynamic in terms of intervention. However, I think as we look broadly at research within CREST and think about the next steps for our program of research into self-management, what is clear that one of the directions we need to go in as a research group is focusing on how to support self-management in people who have extra burden or extra difficulties. So we know that one of our future areas of research is going to be figuring out how to support wellness strategies in people who have, for example, more than one condition, or people who are living in insecure housing, or are marginalized or disenfranchised in some way, or for example in youth with bipolar disorder, or maybe in older adults, thinking about supporting self-management in people who are in 65, 70 and above. So what we've done over the last few years is produce interesting evidence on self-management that works for the general population in bipolar disorder, but I really see our next steps in this program of research in terms of is pushing ourselves to think about wellness strategies in most diverse populations and how best to support self-management in those populations. Question from the MDAO folks: how do you ensure survey participants represent the diversity of the bipolar population in terms of ethnicity and sexual diversity? You don't, is the answer to that. All you can do is try and recruit as broadly as possible. Think about where you're advertising your project. We work quite hard when we're doing studies like this to really try and get the word out into more unusual advertising or recruitment places. So for example, through different social media sites, through churches, sometimes we advertise through Craigslist. We try and get it out beyond the normal, the regular kind of scientific recruitment sites. However, it's very difficult to figure out where people came from, where they saw the study from afterwards. And then really much of what you can do is just look at the diversity of the sample that you get in the end and comment on the gaps in that. Do I think we've had an ideal representation from different ethnicities in this sample? No, it won't be ideal. But what we can at least do is start to get some hints, perhaps, of how self-management might work in different populations and where we need to be more purposeful and thoughtful about recruiting with diversity in mind in the next steps of research. Another question from the MDAO on how do you recommend people with bipolar disorder deal with the stigma in accessing psychosocial treatments? It's a great question, very relevant for us as we gather around World Bipolar Day, which is really designed to try and tackle some of the stigma that is relating to bipolar disorder. We know that people who are highly self-stigmatized with bipolar disorder are less likely to access treatment, they're less likely to take medications for their treatment, and they're less likely to reach out to others for support and care. So from my perspective as a clinician and a health researcher, I think probably one of the most effective points of leverage we can have in terms of dealing with stigma in healthcare settings is addressing self-stigma. Is starting with a person and helping them navigate their way to a place where their bipolar disorder is just part of who they are. It isn't all-encompassing, it isn't overshadowing, and they've navigated to a place where they have a healthy relationship with their bipolar disorder and have, as a result of that, probably navigated. Thank you. Another question from the MDAO. God, you guys are working me hard today. I'm just going to go for another 2 or 3 minutes at this point so that we can actually end at what will be noon my time, just to give you a heads up. But a question from the MDAO, can you briefly talk about any other research projects CREST.BD is involved with besides the Delphi project? The one that we've been working the most hard on and that we are incredibly excited about at this stage is funding from the Canadian government to, as I mentioned before, build a resource center for self-management strategies for bipolar disorder. It's going to be the culmination of almost 2 years of really hard work. This is a project that we're also heavily partnering with the Mood Disorders Association of Ontario to develop. And let me just tell you about one neat aspect of that particular project. We're going to be testing out something called a living library idea. And so what we'll have is this web resource center containing really evidence-based resources for bipolar disorder housed within it. The living library is going to be a way of testing out how do we help people to navigate that information, how do we tour them around the information in the resource center and help them personalize it for their own particular life circumstances. In the living library model, what they'll be able to do is a person from anywhere in Canada will be able to Skype or phone in to a CREST.BD expert, and that expert will help navigate them around the resource center. So for example, you could be a youth just diagnosed with bipolar disorder in Prince George. You can phone CREST.BD. You'll be paired up with an expert of your choice. So that expert could be somebody with bipolar disorder or somebody with bipolar disorder, or it could be a bipolar clinician, and they will help, help make the information there make sense for where you're at in your particular life. So watch this space. We're going to be coming out east and touring around the beta version of that web resource center in Toronto and in some surrounding areas in September, and we'll be launching shortly after that. So please do get engaged in that project if it's of interest to you. Lovely question, thank you. And it's great to see some of you are saying you'd like to get involved in future research. That's what we're here to do. I want to put a big thank you out to all of you who've joined us online today, and a big thank you again for the people who've participated so far in the Delphi project. It's something that we've worked very, very hard on. We think it's going to yield some really interesting results, and I'll be looking forward to sharing those results with you imminently. I think about 6 weeks from now we'll be able to share at least the next distilled version of the self-management strategies down. So watch this space, watch our blog. Please get in touch and stay engaged with the work that we're doing. Thank you very much for your time today.